All right, welcome to Chapter 3 on cell biology. Now, Chapter 2 was on the chemistry, and we said, oh yeah, this is review from Bio 1111. We kind of smushed a few chapters together, and that's the same here in Chapter 3. Everything that you find in this chapter would have been covered in that introductory biology course. The reason that it is in this human anatomy and physiology course, though, is because everything about how the body works, how it functions, really is occurring on a cellular level. So we may be much more interested in, say, studying the cardiovascular system, but when things go right, it's because the cells are doing their job, and when things go wrong, it's a dysfunction here at this cellular level. So it is very important to understand some of these concepts about cells, and ideally, this is some of that kind of baseline information that you really want to have easily accessible in your brain so that you can then apply it to all sorts of different areas. As we move through different systems, both this semester and in AMP2, we'll keep coming back to some of this cellular machinery, some of the slight differences in different systems, and really how these cells work. So, one thing I did want to point out, this idea of cell theory, right? Realize that scientists haven't understood cells forever. In fact, there's always more to understand. But even, when early anatomists were digging up bodies and trying to learn about, say, the heart, they had no idea what was going on at the cellular level. So a couple of these sound really basic, but it was a big kind of paradigm shift as people started to realize that all organisms, including humans, are made up of what we call cells. Cells come from cells, right? There's no spontaneous generation. That was the old school thought, and we started to understand that through that process of mitosis or meiosis that we could actually make copies of cells. And you might start out as a single cell, right, as that zygote, but every cell that now makes up the millions of cells, billions of cells in your body came from that original cell, right, and the division that took place. Cells are the simplest structural and functional unit of life, right? So anatomical, physiological unit of life. There are single-celled organisms, right, that are able to complete all those vital processes of life inside of that single cell. For you and I and many other organisms that are multicellular, we'll see that those cells are working together, but it still really comes down to the functions that are taking place within those cells. And again, kind of hearkening back to why we talk about cells here in anatomy class, is that when you look at the anatomy and physiology, right, the structure and function of organisms, it is ultimately due to what is going on at the cellular level. Now, cells come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. We'll talk some about that generalized cell and what the organelles are and what they have in common. But what you'll start seeing as we move through systems is that there is a lot of specialization that takes place there, right? So a few of these that you will see a lot, this is a new term for most people, squamous, is referring to cells that are flat, like a pancake, right? And so this terminology, as you pick it up, when you move on to Chapter 4 and start talking about tissues, when they say simple squamous epithelium, you're going to know, right, okay, there's something about that cell being flat, right? Cuboidal, they're little boxes, columnar, they are columns, right? So some of this terminology isn't too bad. And then we get a lot of variation in here. So these discoid cells, like a red blood cell, we'll talk about those particulars when we get to those body systems that have such dramatic specializations of cells, right? A couple cool examples. So there was the red blood cell that we were just talking about, right? Highly specialized for carrying oxygen. And remember, structure and function always go together, right? That is time and time again. So if the function is to carry oxygen, what we see is that red blood cells actually don't have a nucleus. During their maturation process, they ditch the nucleus to make more room for carrying oxygen, right? So a very specialized cell. Adipose cells, right, if this is one cell, the nucleus is pushed way over to the side, and this is actually just a huge vacuole filled with triglycerides, right? A very specialized cell that helps us store energy, provides insulation, etc. We will this semester talk about muscle cells. Again, totally packed full of proteins in a way that we won't see in other cells, and that's going to give it that very unique function that allows it to contract and move our bodies. Someone was asking when we were talking about pH, right? Why doesn't our stomach just dissolve because all of that acid's in there? And I said the answer is, well, there's mucus. And so here's an example of a very specialized cell. It's called a goblet cell. This cell will be found in the lining of the digestive tract, and all of this orange is actually the mucus that it's producing and pushing out to the surface. So I know it's really easy to think cells are kind of boring, kind of bland. We talked about them in 1111, but this is the cool stuff, right? And so as we start moving through systems, we can build on the base knowledge that we're getting here in this chapter. Okay, I can't leave this subject before I remind you, in fact, I think I stole this from your Gen Bio textbook, that a key thing to understand about cells is this idea of surface area to volume ratio, okay? Cells are tiny, right? They average somewhere around 10 micrometers, right? And that little right, for micrometer is 1/1000th of a millimeter, right? So think of that smallest little marking on a ruler. A micrometer is 1/1000th of that. They are tiny. And part of the reason that cells are small is because there is an ideal ratio of the surface area, right? All of the sides that are touching kind of the outside world to the volume, the amount of space inside of the cell. So look what happens here. They basically tried to make a big cell, some medium cells, and some small cells. And what they're trying to impress on you here is the difference. These all have basically the exact same volume, right? So here they're showing volume, height times width times length times the number of cubes, right? They've broken this up into 64 cubes, 8 cubes, and 1 single cube. But notice what happens, right? And you can kind of see this visually. Boom, boom, and boom. Basically the same volume. But what varies dramatically here then is the smaller the cube is, right? The more cubes there are in that same volume, there's much more surface area, right? Because you have to picture all 6 sides of all of those cubes, right? And what that does is give us a ratio here. And so you don't have to memorize any of these numbers, but the point is that cells are really small so that they can maximize the surface area to volume relationship, right? Surface area, you will hear me say it over and over and over again, and a lot of our specialized cells are doing things to say increase their surface area, because surface area is where that cell interacts with its outside world, right? How it interacts with its neighbor, how it interacts with the fluids that are transported throughout the body. So surface area becomes very important, right? And here, with our kind of a little generic drawing of a cell for you, right? Again, notice, here's our cell membrane. That's the surface. It is the separation from inside of the cell and outside of the cell. Anything that's going to be exchanged, so if that's oxygen at the lungs or oxygen from the blood to a working muscle tissue, all of this happens across the cell membrane, getting rid of waste, bringing in nutrients, and so surface area to volume relationship ends up being key. Okay, a real quick general look at our cell. So inside of the cell we have cytoplasm. That includes the cytosol, which is really kind of the liquidy gel material that's suspending the organelles, the little organs, and the cytoskeleton, the structural, kind of the protein fibers that are maybe giving that cell structure. Okay. The outside of the cell membrane, and we will talk about this a lot in this chapter, this plasma membrane or cell membrane is made up of phospholipids. About 80% of the cell membrane is phospholipids, and about 20% of this are actually proteins that are embedded in that phospholipid bilayer. We'll also see some cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid that's going to help give fluidity, flexibility to this cell membrane. Okay. Now, really key on here is we tend to use this term cytosol or talk about the cytoplasm a lot in Bio 1111. You will much more now in a physiology class see the term intracellular fluid versus extracellular fluid used, right? So ICF, intra, within the cell, fluid, versus extracellular, outside of the cell. And the reason we kind of shift our language here is really in physiology, what we're interested in is kind of what's moving in and out between these spaces. And so we'll discuss quite a bit about how different substances can move in and out of the cell across this membrane. So there is a much better, much more realistic image of that phospholipid bilayer with the proteins embedded, and again, inside of the cell versus outside, okay? And some of the things we're gonna look at, right, we won't get into it so much now, but even things like, oh yeah, in the intracellular fluid, the major cation tends to be potassium, while the major cation in the extracellular fluid is sodium, right? So the chemistry is gonna keep coming, but we'll talk about that really when we get into cells like muscles or neurons, where those ion balances are important. Here, we're gonna focus much more on generalizations about cells.